Story 1. Alfred Wegener, who first proposed continental drift, which would ultimately become plate tectonics, was considered an outsider by geologists of his time and they rejected his theory. Story 2. Christine Collins, famously portrayed by Angelina Jolie in the movie Changeling, experienced a harrowing ordeal when her son was abducted. The police found him months later and reunited them. However, Christine was adamant that it wasn't her son, Walter, and insisted he was an imposter. Even though she had evidence to prove it, she was temporarily committed by the officer in charge of the case. Even after the child admitted he had lied and wasn't Walter, it still took over a week to release Christine. Story 3. Kotaku Wamura was the longtime mayor of the Japanese town of Fudai from the 1940s to the 1980s. While mayor, he learned that the town had been devastated in the past by tsunamis and ordered the construction of an enormous seawall. While other towns in the area also had seawalls, this one was considered insanely high. The project was hideously expensive, and he was relentlessly mocked. He died in 1997. In 2011, a tsunami struck Japan, killing around 20,000 people. The seawall worked as planned, protecting Fudai, and the town escaped almost untouched. Story 4. Gustave Caillebotte was born to a wealthy Parisian family in 1848. His father owned a textile business that he later inherited. He was an artist in his own right but became much more known as a supporter of the arts. Fearful he would die young, he wrote in his will that the French state accept his large art collection, today valued at several $billion, and display works from several Impressionist artists, who were friends of his, in a national museum upon his death. Caillebotte died young, at 45, in 1894 as he predicted, and so his will attempted to be executed. The French government initially refused the request. Pundits and critics, from art to politics, viewed the request as absurd and publicly expressed how repulsed they were by the collection itself. Several art professors from the School of Fine Arts threatened to resign if the government enacted the will. In the end, half of Caillebotte's art collection was displayed in 1897 at the Luxembourg Museum, and the public came out in droves to visit the gallery because of all the press Caillebotte's request had received after his death. People wanted to see this ugly art. The artists featured. Their names were Monet, Renoir, Degas, Cezanne, Manet, Pissarro, and Sisley. It is very possible these artists would never have become the household names they are today had Caillebotte not liked the ugly, unsellable art that a few of these friends of his made. Story 5. Some of the elderly patients with dementia in a home in my city kept complaining they were not given food. Everyone thought they must have forgotten that they had already eaten, as people with dementia sometimes do. No, it turns out some negligent nursing staff did not always give everyone their meals, among other abuse. Story 6. Sister Kenny and her physical therapy for polio victims. The treatment at the time was to lock up the affected limbs in braces or casts, leaving the patient crippled for life. Her idea of using hot compresses and gently moving the limbs took a very long time to be accepted by the medical establishment as she was a woman and just a nurse. Story 7. Writer Ernest Hemingway was convinced the Federal Bureau of Investigation had him under surveillance. His friends and family told him he was paranoid until some unsealed records a while back proved that he actually was being followed and had his phones bugged. Story 8. Ludwig Boltzmann. His equations and formulas explained the physical properties of matter, but as it went against the then accepted laws of physics, he was ridiculed and ignored for years while fighting for atom theory to be accepted. He took his own life just 3 years before Ernest Rutherford discovered the nucleus of an atom, proving Boltzmann's theory. Story 9. Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1846, Semmelweis proposed the idea that hand-washing could prevent the spread of disease in hospitals. He was ridiculed during his time, sent to a mental asylum, and died forgotten by his peers. Story 10. Barry James Marshall was one of the scientists who discovered that the bacteria Helicobacter pylori causes stomach ulcers. However, getting people to believe it was difficult. It was thought that lifestyle and excessive stomach acid were the main factors that lead to ulcers, so when he suggested that a bacterial infection could cause it, no one believed him. In response, he infected himself with Helicobacter pylori by drinking cultures, which in turn gave him stomach ulcers, and then treated the infection. He and Robin Warren received a Nobel Prize for this discovery. Story 11. Harlem J. Bretz was a geologist who in the 1920s proposed that the geologic features of the channeled scablands of eastern and central Washington were the result of a massive flood during the last ice age, approximately 15,000 years ago, when a glacial dam in northern Idaho catastrophically collapsed, releasing the waters of Lake Missoula. Lake Missoula is estimated to have contained a volume of water equivalent to Lakes Erie and Ontario combined, and the resulting flood through what is now eastern Washington and out through the Columbia Gorge released a water flow exceeding the combined flow of all other rivers on the planet. Bretz was soundly ridiculed when he proposed this scenario in the 1920s, but was eventually vindicated over the next 50 years and was eventually awarded the Geological Society of America's prestigious Penrose Medal in 1979 at the age of 96. By that time, as he put it, all his detractors were dead, so he had no one left to gloat over. Story 12. Philippa Langley believed Richard III was buried under a car park in Leicester and was found to be correct. And he was. Story 13. Jose Canseco was one of the first players to openly discuss how prevalent steroid use was in the 1990s and 2000s, and people dismissed his claims as being from a player on the decline just trying to stay relevant. Story 14. My grandma insisted people kept stealing her newspaper and specifically said it was someone in a white van. Grandma was always a little off, so we just thought she was paranoid and had a bad delivery person. Until one day, my mom and I were driving past her house, and a white van in front of us stopped, stole my grandma's newspaper, and drove off. Grandma wasn't crazy after all, at least not about that. Story 15. Jackie Stewart. He was sick and tired of burying his friends due to racing accidents, so he started advocating for safety at the tracks, in the cars, and pushing for more qualified medical personnel. He once said, "I'd be more popular if I would shut up and drive. Dead, but more popular." Stewart was a 3-time world champion, for the record. He also won on the hardest track ever built, the Nürburgring Nordschleife, by 4 minutes with a broken wrist. The man was as hard a racer as they come, and yet he was ridiculed for not wanting to see himself and others get injured or killed while racing. Many of the things Stewart pushed for then are requirements at nearly every racing event today. Story 16. Rose McGowan was talking about people following her and former Israeli intelligence community agents being involved. She was dismissed as insane. Turns out Weinstein had a group of spies following victims to keep them quiet, including the exact people she had described. Story 17. I can't remember his name, but during a huge cholera outbreak, he proposed the theory that it came from the water based on where the cases were. He wasn't believed until a long time later when it was proven to be the water. Story 18. Glenda Cleveland. She was Jeffrey Dahmer's neighbor and made numerous complaints about the smell coming from his apartment and called the police on him a number of times, but nobody listened to her. Story 19. John Lydon of the Sex Pistols tried to warn the world about the crimes of Jimmy Savile in an interview in 1978 and was banned from appearing on the British Broadcasting Corporation for his trouble. Story 20. Hannibal Buress. He was a prominent voice to call out Bill Cosby. At a time when, in the black community, saying bad things about Cosby is like being a Catholic and bad-mouthing the Pope. Story 21. Lieutenant David Steves. On May 9, 1957, he was on a mission to fly a new training jet, a Lockheed T-33, from Hamilton Air Force Base in Novato, California, to Craig Air Force Base in Alabama. The plane was lost from radar, and the Air Force could not find the missing plane or pilot. The military declared Steves dead. Until, that is, 54 days later when Steves emerged from the Sierra, having been found badly malnourished and still limping on swollen ankles. His story is heartbreaking. Accused of selling the plane to the Russians because they could not find the wreckage. Poor guy, he died before they finally found the evidence that his story was true all along. Story 22. Lisa Bonet. No, seriously, hear me out. I remember when she quit the Cosby Show back in the 1980s, and people thought she was crazy. First of all, to have a rumored disagreement with America's favorite dad? What was she thinking? Then, she started a relationship with some unique-looking musician named Romeo Blue. Career suicide, we all said. Looking back, she was right on multiple fronts and had excellent taste. Story 23. This guy Randy was relentlessly ridiculed for his aqua dam and then became the only one whose property wasn't wrecked by the flood a couple of years back. Story 24. Marie Adler, a foster child, was raped in her apartment. She reported the rape to the Linwood, Washington Police Department. Her foster mother spoke with the police and mentioned she didn't think Marie was upset enough and thought Marie was lying. There was almost no physical evidence, and the Linwood police forced Marie to retract her story, prosecuted Marie for lying to police, fined her $500, and she lost her apartment. Her story was published in the paper as though she had lied, and she was ridiculed and ostracized by her peers for lying. Her rapist was found several years later. He was a serial rapist who committed rapes in different jurisdictions, and part of his modus operandi was to photograph his victims and force them to shower, just as he had done to Marie. Two female detectives had found a camera the rapist stole from Marie with pictures from the night of her rape, and had recognized the rapist's modus operandi from reading the newspaper stories detailing the punishment Marie had received for reporting the rape to the Linwood police. Story 25. When I was a police officer, there was this lady who called every week and said someone had been in her house. I mean, dozens of officers went out there, and she would say her dresser drawer was open and she knew it had been closed when she left the house. There were never any signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to indicate this was anything other than a misunderstanding. Until months later, one of her high school students was caught with a key to her house. Turns out this kid had been sneaking in and just moving things slightly to disturb her. Story 26. The many British postal workers fired and prosecuted for stealing. Many were lifelong employees. Some committed suicide. This went on for almost 2 decades. Spoiler. It was a software glitch that went ignored for years. They were all innocent. Edit. Surveillance software was an exaggeration on my part and incorrect. I honestly forgot exactly what the software's purpose was, only that it was buggy and incorrectly flagged employees or employee activity in a way that made it look like they were stealing. Story 27. Marshall McLuhan. His theories on how media usage changes how we think and interact with each other were prophetic. He predicted the internet and how a worldwide instant form of communication would create tribes of people centered around their own echo chambers. He also wrote about how using media changes how we think and process information. Considered a crazy pop culture media and literature speculator in the 1960s, now his ideas have been pretty much confirmed by modern neuroscience and communication studies. Sadly, he died before the internet happened. It would have been incredible to see his theories on social media. Story 28. Barry Marshall. Remember in the 80s when everyone seemed to have ulcers, and they were basically treated with antacids? Marshall was a researcher who discovered that Helicobacter pylori bacteria caused ulcers, not just too much acid in the stomach. Unfortunately, no one would believe him, so he documented himself drinking the bacteria, getting ulcers, and successfully treating them with antibiotics. Story 29. The lady who got burned from McDonald's coffee. If I recall, she was so injured she lost 20% of her body weight while hospitalized. McDonald's was later discovered to be intentionally selling extremely hot coffee because you couldn't drink it quickly and thus ordered fewer refills. Story 30. Many years ago, a new stoplight was installed near my house at a busy multi-lane intersection. The first time I approached this light, I was taking a left. I waited in the left turn lane until I got a green arrow and proceeded into the intersection, as did the person coming from my left who was going straight and also had a green light. We almost crashed, but at the time I assumed they had run the light, and I'm sure they assumed the same about me. On my way home, I sat in an adjacent parking lot and watched, and sure enough, the lights were timed completely wrong, giving drivers conflicting rights of way at the same time. I saw 3 other near misses in about 10 minutes. I called the police to report it, and they essentially laughed at me. The next day, 2 people died in a crash at that intersection, and they fixed the light by the end of the next night. I'm guessing they wish they'd taken a look when I told them about it. Story 31. Martha Mitchell. She found out about Watergate, was kidnapped and held captive for a week. When she tried to tell the public what had happened, she was called a liar and crazy. Members of Nixon's administration later confirmed she was telling the truth. Story 32. I had an aunt or cousin, not really an aunt, but everyone in Spanish families calls everyone TIAs or primas. So who even knows? Anyway, she was convinced her then 35-year-old husband was having an affair with her much younger 20-year-old cousin during a summer she let the cousin stay during a visit to the United States. It got to the point where her own family thought she was being crazy. They ended up getting separated, and she was thought of as the paranoid person in the family, and a lot of people sadly turned on her and stopped being in contact. The divorce happened shortly after. And guess who a year after the ex-husband ends up marrying? Yep. Story 33. The woman who said she could smell when someone had Parkinson's disease was dismissed until finally one professor at a university decided to look into her claims. She was right. She could smell Parkinson's. Now they are developing a swab test for the disease thanks to her.